Estamos aqui no Centro de Estudos Internacionais da Fundação Getúlio Vargas com o professor Andrew Hurrell, da Universidade de Oxford, para conversar sobre o livro que ele está escrevendo sobre a atuação do Brasil e Índia em regimes internacionais. So I would like, I think it's better to shift to English now. Okay, as we said, it will be more like a chat about your book, mainly why Brazil and India, what your views on the role of emerging powers and in current international relations.
Well, why don't we start with why Brazil and India? In some ways, quite practically, if you think of emerging powers and you think of, how power is changing, this idea that there is a power shift away from the core Western countries, the old group of seven, towards new rising, emerging, would-be regional powers, all of these different categories. And obviously people think immediately about China, and there is a huge academic literature, huge policy-focused literature on China. And then after that, in the world of the BRICS, people think of India. Even in the case of India, the amount of academic work on India and Indian foreign policy is relatively limited, or it's quite specific. People will write about Indian nuclear policy, or they'll write about liberalization, but there is not so much of a more general kind about India in the world and its role, the way that it's changed. And in Brazil, there's obviously a great deal of production inside Brazil. There's a great deal of debate inside Brazil, but outside Brazil, in English, thinking, writing on Brazil and the world is relatively limited. So one reason for taking Brazil and India is simply that they are important players, and as yet there is relatively little written about them. But there are other reasons as well. I think one of the things that's become very interesting as the project has gone on is the fact that they're both democratic countries. India talks the whole time of being the world's largest democracy. Brazil now has had this long process of the emergence of a stable democratic system. And that's very interesting in the world of emerging powers, because often people in the United States, they talk about, what are the alternatives? And they talk about Russia, they talk about China, they talk about illiberal countries. And the assumption is, well, the liberal countries, that'll be all right, that'll be no problem. They'll just be like us, they'll agree. Well, let's look. Let's take two very big southern democracies and see how they behave. So I think it's really interesting to take them as a case in those terms. It's also interesting for the point of view of the way we've set up the study, is because both of these countries in the early 1990s, they see the end of the Cold War. It's a crisis for the way they used to think about foreign policy. They begin to liberalize their economies more or less at the same time. And so you have a possible expectation that they would come to see their foreign policy and the things that had to change, perhaps in a similar way. In the 1990s, many liberal writers assumed that in an age of globalization, new emerging developing countries would have to change their foreign policies. They were liberalizing their economies, and gradually they would join the world, they'd join international regimes, they'd become more responsible, they'd become more like us. So again, to take the point of comparison, they're both liberal democracies, they begin to liberalize at a similar time. So to see what happens, whether those things are actually true, I think all of that matters. And then the other reason is because of some of the differences. And there are two kinds of differences. One is India, on almost every count, is bigger in terms of power than Brazil. So that lets you see how much power matters. So because India is more powerful in material terms, does that mean that when it negotiates or thinks about its foreign policy, does that explain difference? If you do behave differently if you've got more power. So that's one element of difference. And the other element of difference which we wanted to think about, if you like, is the cultural or civilizational one. India is almost always a non-Western country with a very different set of cultural, of civilization traditions. So again, to see whether that factor plays a role in how India has treated its foreign policy. So there's a pragmatic element of the choice. You know, these are important countries. Certainly in English, there's not so much written. There's very little comparative work on the BRICS. People tend to write on China, on Brazil, just on India. So we wanted to look at comparative work, and we were interested, as I say, because of the things that are similar about them, and also some of the things that are different about them.